Hello, everybody. Waiting to see if my little blue circle stops spinning, which is the only way I know if I'm really live. I might be now. I might be in a second. Okay. Oh, okay. Hi. um, Welcome to another session of the Penyan Action Coalition's online book discussions about The Line Becomes a River by Francisco Cantu. I'm really happy to be back for another session to close out the week. We've had some really great interactions since last Friday when we started this version of our community read events. And I have somewhat fewer comments to read to you folks from our organizers today, but still quite a few. But I think we'll be a little bit shorter today than we were on Wednesday when I really we had a lot of comments and I went on some tangents and digressions here and there. But hopefully that was fun for all of you and interesting and enlightening in some ways, whether you watched it live or if you watched it later. We do appreciate everybody watching. Please do comment. Don't be shy. Give us your thoughts. Let us know what you're thinking about this book and the issues that it raises about the style of writing, the poetry of the writing. All that is part of it. So you might not have something in particular to say about the immigration issue, but maybe you thought that one line was really, really pretty, or maybe you thought that one line was really, really ugly. Let us know. We want to hear your thoughts. And what I am enjoying about getting the comments from the fellow Penyan Action Coalition members is how very much everyone who contributes is in dialogue with one another, even without sitting down and coordinating, having a face-to-face interaction. It's amazing how the threads of one person's comment can be seen to be picked up in another one that I receive later on. So I don't think they're planning it that way. I think it's just the way it's happening, and it's really, really interesting to see. And it gives it a little bit of a sense of as if we were all sitting in a circle together, having this conversation. So today's topic is on the subject of moral injury. And once again, the wonderful Claudia has put together the parameters, the focus for today's discussion. I see Ed and Mickey are here. Hi, Ed and Mickey. And feel free to check in if everybody else is watching. Put a little message in. You don't have to, but if you want to, it makes it feel like I'm not just talking into the void. So yes, we're talking moral injury. And one theme that I picked up on from the various contributors' thoughts so far is that it was moral injury is a term that they were not all familiar with, and I can say that I was not familiar with the term either. And so we are all learning about what moral injury means together. Claudia gives us an overview, saying in part 2, the author shares the examination of moral injury as opposed to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, conducted by David Wood, a veteran war reporter. Unlike PTSD, which is characterized by flashbacks or a startle complex, moral injury is characterized by, quote, sorrow, remorse, grief, shame, bitterness, and moral confusion, and is manifested in, quote, dreams and doubts. In the words of one soldier, quote, moral injury is a learned behavior, learning to accept things that you know are wrong. That's on page 151. Claudia asks, is Cantu suffering from moral injury? Is there evidence, thoughts, comments, observations for this? So again, unlike PTSD, which is characterized by flashbacks or a startle complex, moral injury is characterized by sorrow, remorse, grief, shame, bitterness, and moral confusion. Moral injury is a learned behavior, according to one soldier, learning to accept things that you know are wrong. One of the first responses I got from the group is from our organizer, Nancy. And she writes, in thinking about the passages concerning moral injury, it possibly points out how Border Patrol agents get caught up in the, quote, system. Those who, like Cantu, thought they could help because they spoke Spanish or thought they better understood the culture of the immigrants and why they come to America, slowly slide into moral injury as explained. It is, quote, gradual as they have time to reflect on what they are doing, end quote, were doing, and how they were doing it. Might be the reason so many quit. If or when they leave Border Patrol, I think they carry that injury with them, and at some point it pervades our society. Possibly the reason we see such things as domestic violence, she asks. Nancy also wonders about what happens to the refugees and migrants Border Patrol perpetrates their actions on. Do they suffer moral injury? If you subject people to that type of violence, lack of respect, hatefulness, put them in cages, violate their rights in court, and all the inhumane treatments they suffer, do they not suffer moral injury? Their life is not even worth any type of just treatment. They are expendable and disposable from a certain point of view. So, two main questions I think Nancy is raising there: what the societal impact of that accumulated moral injury is once it kind of bleeds out into the rest of our culture, from Border Patrol agents and others working at the border who return to their homes, their lives, their wives, husbands, children, other jobs. And then what happens to the people that that unjust actions, violent actions are perpetrated upon: the migrants, the refugees. Do they suffer moral injury as well? So if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to comment or provide your own comments. We got another nice set of comments from our co-organizer, Cindy, also. Her comments often form like a little narrative themselves. I appreciate that about Cindy's comments. They are like a look into her thought processes. And she starts by saying, sort of recapping that as we were all emailing back and forth about this next session, as we often do, she had said that she was going to go and spend an hour with moral injury. And she realizes in her follow-up, after having read the section and reviewed the portions about moral injury, she acknowledges people who are morally injured do not have the luxury of spending only an hour with it. They spend their whole lives with it. And Cindy is the first to say that she confesses to say, quote, I was unfamiliar with the term moral injury. PTSD, yes, she was familiar with. But moral injury was new to her, as it was, I think, to many readers. Cindy says, like so many mental health versus physical health maladies, pinpointing diagnoses can be so difficult. And then therapy and treatment present even more challenging hurdles. Cindy also takes a moment to think about Francisco Cantu, the author of the book, and remarking upon his choice to include in the midst of his narrative an essay by this war reporter all about moral injury. So David Wood's thinking about moral injury. Cindy says, it makes me think that Cantu considers himself to be morally injured, or perhaps that he thinks that he may become morally injured from his experience as a Border Patrol agent. When we go against what we know is, quote, right, it becomes easier and easier to justify the, quote, immoral behaviors we see ourselves performing, and all comes back to haunt us again and again and again for the rest of our lives. And again, if you saw my first session last Friday with my admission that I did not manage to get a copy of the book before our lives all started shutting down. So I am reporting from a place of semi-ignorance on the actual content of some of these sections. But it sounds to me like Cantu included this section from David Wood, his report on moral injury, almost like an insertion into his text. And whereas in other parts of the memoir, maybe he cited certain passages here and there from other scholars, other reporters, other writers, but just bits and pieces. It looks to me from what the fellow organizers here are writing to me that he actually inserted whole cloth this report from David Wood. Let me know in the comments if I'm incorrect about that. But if that is the case, it does seem interesting to me that he would choose to do that, almost as if this topic was too difficult for him for whatever reason to tackle in a more personally developed way, in a way he sat down and wrote, here are my thoughts on moral injury, and that it was easier for him to include this other author's work to explain and try to get at what he was feeling. That's what it sounds like to me. Let me know in the comments if I'm off base on that. Cindy continues the section, and this is part of what made me think he just plugged it in, because she talks about there being a section before the essay and a section after the essay. So it sounds as though Wood's essay is smack in the middle of this section, fully formed. So she says the section right before the essay is about Cantu taking care of Beto's dog. The section ends, quote, "That night as dust blew across the desert, I kneeled in the backyard of Beto's home, trembling as I washed blood from the face of an animal." Cindy continues, the section that comes right after Wood's essay is about the 46-year-old small woman, quote, "a quitter," as described by Hayward. Even the image of, quote, "Hayward, Manuel, and Beto standing over a small woman in the middle of a dirt road," end quote, is disturbing. A piece of something that could become morally injurious to those involved, Cindy wonders. She goes on to say that Francisco took her back to the operating house. Much detail is written about her. However, we are not told her name, going back to that question of identity that we've discussed earlier in this discussion series, and how namelessness can be a sort of identitylessness, although Cindy concedes maybe Francisco does not know her name. I see I have a comment from Claudia about the essay. Maybe Cantu inserted this essay as evidence that he is suffering moral injury. He has the dreams, the nightmares, the guilt, anxiety, etc. that are mentioned in the essay. That seems to all track, doesn't it? All right, so Francisco has taken the quote-unquote quitter back to the operating base. We don't know her name. He writes, "Slowly I unraveled a roll of white gauze around each pallid foot, then coerced them gently with an elastic wrap. As I looked up, I saw that the woman had been watching me with her head resting on her shoulder. Eres muy humanitario, oficial. You are a very humanitarian, officer, she told me. I looked down at her feet and shook my head. No, I said, I'm not." And I know another of our organizers is going to return to that moment in one of their comments. But Cindy reflects that passage with the story of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. And here's Cantu wrapping the feet of a woman found wandering in the desert. The immorality of leaving her in the desert, of three men towering over a small, braver, not quitter. This behavior could be injurious to one's understanding of moral behavior. Francisco spends time, thought, and kind, skilled effort in giving this woman comfort and dignity. Does he not want to be morally injured? He is doing the right moral thing to help her. The experience, being left, being rescued, for what? To be kept from her husband, to go back to who knows what. This experience in its entirety is morally degrading to her and morally injurious to the Border Patrol agents. Is Francisco merely being a good person, a good Samaritan, to bring in another biblical reference, with no thought of any moral injury it might have on him? Washing the bloodied face of an animal, a dog, man's best friend, tending the blistered feet of the woman, and in between these two stories, the essay about moral injury, a horrendous sickness that could flavor one's life forever. Does Francisco not want this to happen to him or anyone? He intellectually shares what an expert says, so rather than trying to break it down into something sort of gussied up in an artistic way, it's more of a bald intellectual explanation. He experiences examples of what could become morally injurious. Mickey and or Ed are writing, why, if Cantu is not morally injured, does he end part 2 with his dream with the wolf, where he says, I will make peace between us, O brother wolf? And I remember that's one of our key lines from our discussion of the imagery of the wolf from earlier in our discussion. So it does all come back together, doesn't it? And I think there is very good evidence in the text for Cantu having a sense that he is indeed suffering from this unfortunate malady. Cindy finishes her thoughts by saying the next episode begins with, quote, "The horrible thing is when you are dreaming." So this gets back to perhaps the section that Mickey or Ed is speaking of. "Perhaps after one has had time to, quote, reflect on a traumatic experience," says one Iraq veteran about moral injury. Wood says of moral injury, it sets in slowly, perhaps like a cancer, and pervasively affects or effects a cancer patient's life and the lives of so many in his or her life. So then that does reflect also Nancy's question in our first comment, that it's seeping through the lives of those affected and also those ancillary to them. We have a comment from David. "I wonder what role fear of the other plays, if any, in creating moral injury." I want to say that we have some comments coming up here about the other, so we will maybe hear a little bit more about that. But thank you for participating, David. Thank you for your comment. I next got a contribution from another member involved in Penn Yan Action Coalition. This is John. And I had to think about including this one, I'm going to be honest, because this touches on a theme or an observation that has come up in the planning committee's discussions of this book. Oh, I see I have a comment from Pat. Let me address that first. "The dog was his responsibility." The woman for whom, okay, the woman for whom he takes responsibility. Yes, I'm seeing a parallelism, a sense of responsibility that Cantu is feeling, that's kind of echoed between the dog he's caring for and this woman that they come upon and that he cares for. All right, sorry I got sidetracked for a second there, but keep commenting. I won't try to stop and address every comment because you can see those. But back to this comment, this contribution from John. Like I was saying, he brings up something that we have touched on in our organizational meetings. And I think that it wouldn't be, I wouldn't be talking too far out of school to say that the organizers of these events have been very, very careful about not wanting to unnecessarily alienate or antagonize anyone who might be coming at this topic from any point of view or perspective. We are very conscious of remaining respectful to people's values and opinions and perspectives. And so we're careful about what we put in, into the press releases and the descriptions of these events. But I think it's very fair to discuss a comment like the one I'm about to give you, especially because if we were having these discussions in person, if we were all sitting around in a circle in the library, somebody could certainly bring this point up, and I think it would be fair to address. But I will not, I won't lie, it's perhaps more on the provocative side than a lot of what we've been discussing. So this commenter says, "While reading, I was struck by the similarity of ICE police behavior and the documented behavior of German Gestapo and SS individuals in World War II. I am sure that a very small minority of Germans were troubled by these barbaric behaviors. So the comparison to ICE allows for the minority of ICE members who do not subscribe to the hatred and bias of the majority. John wonders if in the remaining discussions we can recognize the behavior of ICE policemen as totalitarian brutality." I told you it was provocative. P.S. The excuse, quote, "I was only following orders," didn't wash 75 years ago, and it doesn't wash now, in my view, he says. And while that is certainly a series of statements that might raise hackles for some, I think it's a very important question to ask. And I think it's true that you can't fall back on following orders. We've been through that song and dance in world history, and it's important to not give a pass to behavior that may be proven to be inexcusable in once we're, whether we're looking at it now and certainly in hindsight. So all I will say about those comments are, if you have reactions to that, keep your responses as respectful as John's comments were. He wasn't specifically attacking anyone. He's speaking of the tactics of an organization that has been rightly, I would say personally, criticized for its behavior. And I think it is fair to say that there are some members of that organization who fight their best they can against it, and others who do not, and some who revel in it, and some who are horrified of it and probably come home at night and spend the night having this feeling of moral injury and not able to rest, not able to handle it. So I think I'm not usually a both sides kind of guy, but I think that in looking at this issue, we can give ourselves room to consider both sides of this question. All right. We got a couple more comments from the organizers. We have Mickey picks up that line in Spanish, "Eres muy humanitario, oficial." "You are a very humanitarian, officer," she told me. I looked down at her feet and shook my head. "No," I said, "I'm not." The same line that Cindy pointed out in her discussion. Mickey wonders, why does he deny this? Why does he deny that he is humanitarian? Mickey says, of course he is, but is he, quote, justifying his actions? Perhaps connected to John's comment about, are people going to claim following orders? I'm not being humanitarian. I'm not so good. Saying to himself he's only doing his job, which all his other actions are also. Thus, he has no responsibility for them, good or bad. So by rejecting her interpretation of him as humanitarian, he can reject, no, I'm not doing anything good, but I'm also not doing anything negative. Is this a way to protect himself emotionally, psychologically? Mickey continues, I have long thought of those interned both at the border, but all those we put in prison, and the injury we as a society do to those we treat this way. Maybe what we're doing is huge moral injury to them. Returning to that question, are we morally injuring those that we treat this way? Not just those who enact it, but those who suffer it. Whether PTSD is more intense or a lower level of the same kind of injury, but just as bad for the soul or whatever one calls our conscience, we are the ones harming others. Are we suffering from a diminution of our response to the suffering of others like this because it's, quote, industrialized or done by, quote, authority, not by us individually? Are we giving up our personal responsibility under these justifications that, what can we do against the prison industrial complex? What can we do against, constitutional law, state law, whatever? Good questions. And Mickey, I think, probably responding to the previous points about the ICE police, is Cantu's reason for writing the book to raise these kinds of questions. He does not say whether most of the agents he met were kind and altruistic or most were brutal. He's raising that question. I think that's an excellent interpretation. And it's certainly possible to have a book that takes a hardline stance one way or the other. But as I learned in my creative writing career, you don't start a story with the moral in mind. You don't have the lesson that you need to teach and let the story coalesce around that. You start with a story, and Cantu's story is the story of his life, his work as a Border Patrol agent. And I think it's up to us to find the moral that comes through in his factual yet artistic rendering of that story. And then we have comments from Ed. Psychologist Carl Jung talks about the reactions toward the Iron Curtain countries, page 163. I'm not sure if that was Carl Jung or not. He just says Jung. I just assumed, but I suppose he could be quoting some other psychiatrist. But he talks about the reaction towards the Iron Curtain countries on page 163 and indicates that if we politically and socially categorize people as, quote, the very devil, it again makes the individual just a number and a member of the other. So here's more reference to otherization that I believe our pal David earlier brought up. He says that by quote unquote walling ourselves from others, we shut our eyes to evil, and this is the type of thing that's been done by the USA and other major countries toward third world countries, as was done when countries colonized others. As with US economic policies towards Central and South America, United Kingdom over India and the East, European over Africa, always pitting one group, tribe, or religion against each other, then drawing maps that had no recognition of those groups, fomenting constant struggles between them. That's modern history right there. 1950, if not earlier, onward. Ed also brings up one of the books on the reading list. Another one of the excellent projects that Claudia undertook was to put together a reading list of other similar books on similar themes. And Ed brings up the book, This Land is Our Land, talking about how dominant countries have raided the third world and then created these conflicts between those left behind, but leaving no treasure to support themselves. The numbers are staggering. Aid is given to these now impoverished countries, but the ratio is terrible. $1 in aid for every $24 taken in treasure from those countries. So obviously a very wide gulf between what they should have had, what their natural resources and their industrial stock would have provided, and what they actually get after 100 years of pillage. Claudia has added to the comments, I wonder if Cantu feels guilty because he takes more care of the dog than he has of the migrants he encounters in his work. Maybe his foot care of the woman was an act of guilt to make up for other acts he has committed, which make him ashamed. Excellent. Very sobering. And I think it's clear that the specter of moral injury is one that our whole society has to contend with. I'm sorry if I moved quickly through some of that. I did think this was going to be a somewhat shorter session, but these things take on a life of their own. You can comment, keep commenting, even when I go off the air. Of course, it's still there. This video is available for you to watch and comment on, and we look at all the comments as they get added. And perhaps if there is a large number of comments that end up coming in after we are live, then there might be an opportunity for me to condense some of those and share them at a later date. But I think I'm going to stop there. Oh, we have a comment from Ed again. Hang on. Are our current administration and previous administrations' actions of taking away immigrants' individual rights, like court appearances, food, imprisonment, availability of a lawyer, and lumping those individuals into a group of quote-unquote bad people, similar to our country's actions towards Japanese Americans during World War II? And he references George Takei, the beloved actor Sulu from Star Trek, whose own family was swept up in Japanese internment during World War II, and who tells his story in a recent graphic novel called They Called Us Enemy. I'd tell you it's available at the library, but you can't get to the library right now. But one day you can get that from the library. But yeah, I think that's a very apt comparison. And if we learned it from that, I guess 70 years is what it takes to forget something like that, sadly. Okay. So we're continuing these conversations at least through the next week with, we haven't even touched on part 3 of the book yet, and then there is some concluding final chapters and afterwards. And we want to hear from you guys, you listeners, you contributors, about how much more and how much further you would like us to go. I'm having fun with it. I'll keep doing these. And the rest of the Action Coalition seems interested in continuing as well. But we also don't want to just go on ad nauseum, and maybe it's possible to take a break at some point and come back. But I think it's been really great. We've been able to maintain this momentum and not lose steam in the course of all the uncertainty going on in the world outside. So we'll put the question to our viewers, how much more of this you want. We could conceivably wrap up the book by the end of next Friday. Or we could take our time. You know, this whole past week of discussions has been all about part 2. We could potentially come up with enough topics, I should say. Claudia, if she's not running away in terror at the moment hearing this, perhaps she could come up with enough topics to keep us going for another week, a week's worth of topics all about part 3. But give us what you think, what you want, might think is necessary or desirable, and we will take that into consideration. And we can come back on Monday with an announcement about how far we want to go. Okay. Thank you. Mickey's thanking us. Mickey and Ed, thank you too. Yes, thank you to everyone who is viewing these live after the fact. People who are viewing them over on YouTube. We're going to have something in the paper next week, hopefully, so maybe we'll get even more viewers picking up with us and then maybe checking out what we have done previously. And we'll see where we go. We've still got a whole section to go, plus those concluding portions of the book. So we've definitely got more to come. I think I currently have the final bit for part 2, which is on the subject of fear. I think I had that scheduled for this Sunday because I didn't know whether we wanted to push part 2 into another week. I think I won't worry about that as much as I was unsure when I was setting all these up, but given the flexibility of the group and the fact that it's for everybody else in the world, it's just video, you can watch it whenever you want. I think I will make an executive decision to say we won't do that on Sunday. We'll pick it back up on Monday with the final topic for section 2. And that'll give us a weekend to sort of not think about stuff like this too as much. You should still think about it. It's important. But gather your thoughts and we'll continue on Monday. Oh, hey, Peter, thank you too. So I'm going to sign off for now. If you joined us late, you can go back and watch the whole thing. I don't know if it's available immediately or you might have to wait a few minutes to access the video from the beginning. But either way, it will be available on YouTube later as well. So if you're not sure how to access the live video here, we'll check it out on YouTube. That's on the library's YouTube page, Penn Yan Public Library. All right. Thank you, everyone. We will talk again soon. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the sunshine. Bye-bye.